Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. My name is Salal, and welcome to Popcorn and Soda, the show where we discuss all things movies, pop culture, and so much more. On today's show, we're reviewing one of my top 10 most anticipated films of the year, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Directed by one of my favorite directors, Mr. Zack Snyder, famously known for Zack Snyder Justice League Cut, the Snyder Cut, Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, 300, Watchmen, Army of the Dead. I am a massive, massive fan of Zack Snyder. So, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, is the sequel to Rebel Moon Part 1, Child of Fire, which came out late last year, to pretty lukewarm overall reviews from the community in its entirety pretty much. But I have to be fair, I had a great time with Rebel Moon Part 1. I actually really enjoyed that movie, and I accepted the movie for what it was. It was what a Zack Snyder space opera would end up looking like. So personally, I loved Rebel Moon. I truly did. I thought it was a good movie. Yes, it had its faults and its cliches and the Zack Snyderisms, but that's what I enjoy about Zack Snyder. He is unapologetically himself. So, we're back, wrapping up the story in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. What did I think of this film? Is this a movie that builds upon Rebel Moon Part 1? Is it a better movie than Rebel Moon Part 1? Does this let me down more so than Rebel Moon Part 1? The answer to that question is, in many ways, I liked it better than Rebel Moon Part 1. And in many ways, I thought it was a big downgrade from Rebel Moon Part 1. But that's not to say that I did not have a great time with this movie, because I did have a good time with Rebel Moon Part 2. And that's largely because I really enjoyed the first one. I thought it was just so well thought out in terms of the characters. I really just connected with the characters. And yes, I get it. People are going to start picking holes and saying, well, this is Han Solo, this is that, this is that. I get it. But for me, I watch movies for the sake of watching movies. I'm not going in to try to find comparisons to other movies. And sometimes our unbiased conscience sometimes does that. But with me, I leave all my biases at the door when I'm walking into a theater or if I'm watching it at home on streaming. So, as always, let's start with the things that I really liked about Rebel Moon Part 2. So, it literally picks up right where the first one ended, in which our core characters return back to the world of wealth, in which it's a farmer community where they just harvest grain and they live a very simple life. And after the events of the first one, our team comes back home, and it kind of really picks up right there. We find out very early that something major that happened in the first movie didn't actually end up happening. Again, we don't talk spoilers here on the show, so I think you can put two and two together as to what event I'm talking about if you've seen the trailers and if you know what happens in the end of Rebel Moon Part 1. And that's where the movie picks up, and it doesn't skip a beat. It literally goes right into it. And that's what I really enjoyed about this film, is the cast, because I connected with these characters in the first movie, and in the second one it just continues. Of course, led by Sofia Boutella, Jamin Hanzu, Michaela Hausman, Ed Skrein, Stas Nair. It's a really good and strong cast that all gel together, and it's like that Seven Samurai, Guardians of the Galaxy, bunch of like different misfits getting together to pretty much stop this war against Ed Skrein character, General Atticus Noble, who is trying to find the character of Korra, who is also Arthaleus, who happened to be an assassin in her previous life. I know it gets a lot, and there's a lot of layers to it, but if you watch Rebel Moon Part 1, you're not going to be confused about what's going on, because it literally picks up the same day where Rebel Moon Part 1 ends. So that's something that I really, really enjoyed about this film. Now, another thing that I really enjoyed about this film is that it was very like a contained story, whereas the first one, and this is like a Zack Snyder thing where sometimes we get lost in the mythos that he's trying to build. But in the first one, it was very story heavy, and I get it. You have to establish those foundations. But this movie was exactly what it was. It was a war movie, and it felt more episodic than a movie itself. And that's not a bad thing, really, because for people who enjoyed the first one, like myself, we pretty much continued and carried on exactly from where the movie ended. And I'm sure Zack Snyder's a big Game of Thrones fan because there's so many different elements and callbacks to so many different Game of Thrones episodes. And one that I really enjoyed is one of my favorite parts of the movie, if not the favorite part, is before they're going into battle. It's like a day or two before. All of our heroes, they're sitting on this table, exposing their true stories and what it took to get to where they are today. And that reminded me of the episode Before the Long Night, where we have the Battle of Winterfell, in which all of our heroes are together around the fireplace, almost the last goodbye, the last supper. And I really enjoyed that about this movie. I love hearing the stories of all of our main protagonists. And it was an awesome, just, I think it was almost like a 20-minute like scene in which everyone had a moment where they were really vulnerable, and I loved it. And again, I think that's one thing that I felt about this movie is that it felt very episodic and it really carried on from Rebel Moon Part 1. Another thing that I enjoyed the battle. Like, again, there's a level of disbelief you need to have in a movie like this where pretty much what happens is our heroes, they train these group of farmers to be warriors. More on that a bit later. But there's some really cool action shots. Of course, you know, it's Zack Snyder. You're going to get your slow-mo. You're going to get that intense score, that gladiator vibes. But a character that I thought was underutilized in the first one, and I still felt was underutilized in this movie, but had a really cool scene, was the robot Jimmy, aka James. He had like his Wonder Woman scene from Batman vs Superman where she comes in and saves the day, and there was an awesome scene in the movie in which James does that. So like, again, it was almost like Rebel Moon 1.5 or like Rebel Moon, like, I don't want to say 2, because I just felt that it was very episodic. It was a very small contained story, and I think that was cool. It didn't have to become something that it wasn't, especially with the first one, with how deep it got into like the mythology of the film. So those are the things that I liked. Things that didn't really gel with me in Rebel Moon Part 2 is Ed Skrein, as I mentioned, was my favorite character in the first movie, General Atticus Noble. And in many ways, he was my favorite character in this movie as well. His screen presence in the first movie, just the way he physically looks, his uniform, his acting, I thought it was one of the most like screen presence of a movie character last year that I've seen. Like, I'm such a big fan of Ed and his acting. He's such a great actor. In this movie, I kind of felt he was a little underutilized, where he was just like this character who is on this war path to bring Arthaleus to just, you know, bring her in for the war crimes that she has done so he can get a seat at the Senate. And it was very one-dimensional versus the first movie where it's very three-dimensional, where you got to know a lot more of his motivations behind it. But again, like, this was a very like lean film where there wasn't a lot of excess fat with mythology, backstories, this and that, except for a couple of scenes that really required it. So that was definitely something that was a little interesting to me, because I found that someone who's got such screen presence, he didn't necessarily have it as much in this one, but that's a minor nitpick, but it was definitely something that I noticed. Now, the second thing that I wasn't the biggest fan of, and it kind of goes in with what I mentioned about something I liked, is this like the war scene, the fighting scenes, the battles, it had all the war movie cliches in it. It had the tragic romance on the battlefield. It had, that all is lost, but here come our backup. It had the motivational speeches. It had all those tropes, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me personally, I always find like cliches in movies to sometimes be like a lazy form of writing, because it's like, all right, like I get it. This is the hero moment. Everyone's gonna fight for a while and become, saviors. But you can kind of pick up really quickly as to what's going to happen with each character. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it was just something that I was able to pick up pretty quick. And I'm sure a lot of you did as well. So the other thing, again, as I mentioned, is there's this level of disbelief in the movie in which we have to believe that these farmers, these simple town folk, become warriors in matter of days. And yes, a lot of them do sadly face their demise in the battle, but a lot of them actually stand strong and end up killing forces of like these evil empire that are like trained killers. So that was a little out there and took me out of it a little, but hey, it's a movie we enjoyed for what it is. So it's interesting because this isn't even really something I disliked, but it was something that I didn't really expect. The movie does end with some open threads about a potential sequel. And as far as everything we've been told, part 1 and part 2 are the only 2 films in this series. So it's possible there could be a Rebel Moon part 3. And if there is, I'd be all up for it. But it was definitely kind of a curveball because, as I mentioned, it's a very episodic movie where it's a finite story where they wrap it up from the beginning to the end. And then at the very end, they kind of throw this thing in there. And I'm like, is that really needed? But hey, it was in there. It felt very much like the Snyder Cut in many ways, but Justice League, just a lot of the little parallels with stories and open-ended character endings. So yeah, that was something that was interesting, that I would say. Now, you guys know me. I don't rate movies on stars, numbers, scores, or anything like that. To me, art's in the eye of the beholder. Something that I like, you may not, and something that you like, I may not. And hey, that is perfectly okay. That's the beauty of film, and that's the beauty of art, right? We all view things differently. So, for me, if you're new to the channel, this is how it works. Is this a movie you watch at a movie theater? Is this a streaming movie? Or is this a rainy day movie where you're kind of just flipping through your streaming platform of choice? You throw on a movie like in the background as you're like on your phone or just doing other things. It's streaming on Netflix. So this is, to me, I would say it's definitely a streaming film. If it was playing in a theater, I personally would go watch it in a theater because I really had a great time with the first one. And I love Zack Snyder's movies because I think he's such a unique disruptor of a director. So I would have watched it in theaters, but I think for the majority of everyone, watch it on Netflix if you did enjoy the first, because I will definitely say you cannot go into this movie blind. And like a lot of sequels you can, where you can kind of pick up on story ends. And they kind of do like a little like 1 minute recap at the start of the movie. But I personally don't think that you're going to get anything. You'll get something out of it, but you're not going to get a full experience if you haven't seen Rebel Moon Part 1 before going into Rebel Moon Part 2. So overall, guys, I enjoyed Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. I think there was much left to be desired, but at the same point, it was a finite story, felt very episodic, and we got closure to a lot of our heroes from the first one. And I think it set up like the scene for the next movie. So did I enjoy it more than Rebel Moon Part 1? No. I thought Rebel Moon Part 1 was a really good movie. I really enjoyed Rebel Moon Part 1. And I enjoyed this too, but just not as much. And just the delay from the first part to the second. I think it came out like 4 months apart. I think maybe it would have been better if it came out together because there wasn't that much like hype for this movie. It kind of just dropped on Netflix, which I think is unfortunate because I really enjoyed it. And I think if they had a closer release, or even at the same time, like potentially people could have not gotten turned off by a lot of the reviews that were out there for Rebel Moon Part 1. But hey, end of the day, as I say, movies are subjective. And as long as you're fair to your criticism and to what your likes and dislikes are, your opinion is equally as valid as mine, if not more, because it's yours. So there you have it, guys. That was my review of Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, directed by one of my favorite and most beloved directors, Mr. Zack Snyder. What did you guys think of Rebel Moon Part 2? Comment below and please do share your thoughts, as I'm curious to see what you guys felt about the second part of this journey and the story of Korra. As always, please remember to like, share, give this video a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. And that was my review of Rebel Moon Part 2.